In the year 612 BC, a terrifying sound echoed across the plains of northern Mesopotamia. It was not the roar of lions or the thunder of a storm. It was the sound of walls crumbling. The great city of Nineveh, the jewel of the ancient world, was burning. And inside those burning palaces, thousands of clay tablets, the collected knowledge of an entire civilization, began to bake in the heat. Those tablets would survive for 2,600 years buried in ash, but the empire that wrote them would not. This is the story of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, the first true superpower in human history, and this is how it rose to rule the world and why it vanished so completely that later generations thought it was a myth. To understand the Neo-Assyrian Empire, we have to go back to a time when Assyria was nothing special. Around 1200 BC, the entire Bronze Age world collapsed. Empires like the Hittites and the Egyptians shrank. Trade routes died. Cities were abandoned. For about 150 years, the region that is now Iraq, Syria, and Turkey fell into a dark age. In the middle of this chaos sat the old kingdom of Assyria, centered on the city of Ashur, and for a while the Assyrians struggled just like everyone else. They were squeezed by neighboring peoples, the Aramaeans to the west, the Babylonians to the south. Assyrian kings watched their territory shrink. They were not conquerors, they were survivors. But survival changes a people. By 911 BC, a new line of kings decided they had had enough of being pushed around. They looked at the fragmentation around them and saw opportunity. Where other kingdoms saw chaos, the Assyrians saw a vacuum waiting to be filled. Part 2. The Invention of Empire. The first great reformer was a king named Adad-nirari II. He ruled from 911 to 891 BC. Before him, Assyrian armies would raid a city, steal what they could carry and go home. The next year, that same city would rebel because nothing had fundamentally changed. Adad-nirari II changed that. He introduced a radical new idea: permanent conquest. When his army took a city, they did not leave. They tore down the walls. They installed an Assyrian governor. They imposed an annual tax on grain, straw, and silver, and most importantly, they left a garrison of soldiers to make sure the taxes kept coming. This was the birth of the imperial model, a central power ruling over distinct, diverse populations that had lost their sovereignty. The conquered people were not killed, they were absorbed, and they were expected to work for the Assyrian king. This system required something that no empire before had ever truly mastered: bureaucracy. The Neo-Assyrian king started keeping meticulous records. Clay tablets from this period show lists of tribute payments, grain distributions, and population counts. Every sheep, every jug of wine, every pound of copper was tracked. The king at the center had asymmetrical power over the periphery. The people on the edges of the empire had no army, no king, and no say. They produced food and materials. The center consumed them. That vertical line of control became the signature feature of the Assyrian state. So what made the Assyrian army so much better than everyone else's? The answer is not bravery, it is chemistry. Between 1200 and 900 BC, the technology of iron smelting spread across the Near East. Iron ore is common. It is cheaper than tin and copper, which are needed to make bronze. But iron is harder to work. It requires higher temperatures and more skill. The Assyrians mastered iron production faster than their neighbors. By 900 BC, their armies were equipped with iron weapons from head to toe: iron spears, iron swords, iron arrowheads. Their helmets were iron. Their scale armor was iron. An Assyrian soldier facing a Bronze Age enemy had a massive advantage. A bronze sword will bend and dull quickly. An iron sword stays sharp and straight. When thousands of Assyrian soldiers charged with iron weapons, their enemies simply broke. But the weapons were only half the story. The Neo-Assyrian army was also the first truly professional standing army in history. Most ancient armies were levies. Farmers picked up spears in the spring, fought for a few months, then went home to harvest their crops. The Assyrians created a full-time army. Soldiers did not farm, they trained, year-round. They marched in formation, they built siege towers, they dug tunnels under walls, they practiced archery until they could fire accurately from horseback. This was expensive. Feeding and equipping a standing army required a massive tax base, which meant the army had to keep conquering new lands to pay for itself. That created a feedback loop. Expansion to secure resources, more resources to fuel more expansion. The empire grew because it had to. Part 4. The kings who built the machine. Let us talk about the men who ran this machine. The Neo-Assyrian period produced some of the most fascinating and terrifying rulers in history. First, Ashurnasirpal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BC. He moved the capital to the city of Kalhu, which the Bible calls Kala. He built a massive palace decorated with stone reliefs showing his military victories. And he threw a party. We have his own inscription describing the banquet he held to dedicate his new palace. He claims to have fed almost 70,000 people over 10 days. The menu included 1,000 cattle, 1,000 calves, 10,000 sheep, 1,000 lambs, 1,000 deer, 10,000 fish, 10,000 eggs, and endless bread and beer. But Ashurnasirpal also set the tone for Assyrian cruelty. His inscriptions boast of flaying rebellious leaders alive and displaying their skins on city walls. He impaled prisoners on stakes around conquered cities as a warning. This was not random savagery. It was psychological warfare. The Assyrians wanted their enemies to surrender without a fight. Terror was a tool of statecraft. Next came Shalmaneser III, who ruled from 859 to 824 BC. He expanded the empire west all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. He fought a coalition of 12 kings at the Battle of Karkar in 853 BC. Among his enemies was a king named Ahab of Israel. The battle ended in a stalemate, but Shalmaneser claimed victory anyway. This is the first time the Bible and Assyrian records describe the same events. Then came a period of decline. Weak kings lost territory. The empire shrank, but the Assyrians would not stay down. In 745 BC, a general seized the throne and took the name Tiglath-Pileser III. He is the second founder of the empire. Tiglath-Pileser III reorganized everything. He broke up the old system of hereditary governors. Instead, he appointed officials loyal only to him. He could promote them or execute them at will. He created a postal system using relay riders. He standardized weights and measures across the empire. He made Aramaic the second official language alongside Assyrian, which allowed him to communicate with his diverse subjects. He also perfected the policy of mass deportation. When he conquered a region, he would move entire populations hundreds of miles away and bring different conquered peoples in to replace them. This broke local loyalties. A person living in a strange land surrounded by strangers cannot easily rebel. Between 745 and 727 BC, Tiglath-Pileser III deported hundreds of thousands of people. The Bible's lost tribes of Israel were almost certainly victims of this policy. Part 5. The Peak of Power. Now we reach the absolute height of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The peak came under 3 kings of the Sargonid dynasty. First, Sargon II, who ruled from 721 to 705 BC. He built a completely new capital city from nothing. He called it Dur-Sharrukin, which means Fortress of Sargon. The city was a perfect square, surrounded by massive walls with 7 gates. Inside, his palace covered 25 acres and contained over 200 rooms. He died in battle, a rare fate for an Assyrian king. Then came Sennacherib, who ruled from 704 to 681 BC. He abandoned his father's new capital and moved the government to the ancient city of Nineveh. He transformed Nineveh into a wonder of the world. He built an aqueduct to bring fresh water from 50 kilometers away. The aqueduct was made of 2 million carefully cut stones. He built a palace so grand, he called it the palace without a rival. He filled it with gardens planted with exotic trees and plants from every corner of the empire. Some historians believe Sennacherib's gardens were the real hanging gardens of Babylon, not Nebuchadnezzar's. Sennacherib is also famous for his campaign against the kingdom of Judah. The Bible describes how he surrounded Jerusalem, but failed to take it because an angel killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. The Assyrian records tell a slightly different story. Sennacherib's own inscriptions brag that he shut up the Judean king Hezekiah in Jerusalem like a bird in a cage. He does not claim to have captured the city, but he does claim to have taken 46 other cities and deported over 200,000 people. So both sources agree, Jerusalem survived, but Judah was devastated. Sennacherib was assassinated by his own sons in 681 BC. His son Esarhaddon seized the throne and immediately faced rebellions everywhere. And this is where the empire reaches its true peak, under Esarhaddon, who ruled from 681 to 669 BC. Esarhaddon did what no Assyrian king had ever done. He marched his army across the Sinai Desert and invaded Egypt. Egypt was ancient. Egypt was wealthy. Egypt had never been conquered by a foreign power from Asia, but the Egyptian pharaohs of the 25th dynasty were Nubians from the south, and their rule was unstable. In 671 BC, Esarhaddon led his army into the Nile Delta. He fought 3 major battles in 15 days. He captured Memphis, the Egyptian capital. He took the pharaoh's family prisoner. He declared himself king of Upper and Lower Egypt. For the first time in history, a single empire controlled territory from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea to the Nile River. That is the peak of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. The year is 671 BC. The empire covers more than 1 million square kilometers. It rules over dozens of distinct peoples: Assyrians, Babylonians, Aramaeans, Phoenicians, Israelites, Egyptians, Cimmerians, Medes, and many more. Esarhaddon died in 669 BC while preparing another Egyptian campaign. His son Ashurbanipal took the throne. Part 6. The Scholar King. Ashurbanipal is one of the most fascinating figures in ancient history. He ruled from 668 to roughly 631 BC. He was a warrior like his fathers. He crushed a rebellion in Babylon with brutal efficiency. He destroyed the Elamite civilization to the east so completely that archaeologists still struggle to find Elamite sites. His reliefs show him feasting in a garden while the severed head of the Elamite king hangs from a tree. But Ashurbanipal was also an intellectual. He was the only Assyrian king who learned to read and write. He collected tablets. He sent scribes to every corner of Mesopotamia to copy ancient texts. He built a library at Nineveh that held over 30,000 clay tablets. Because of Ashurbanipal's library, we have the Epic of Gilgamesh. We have Babylonian creation myths. We have astronomical observations. We have medical texts, omen lists, and dictionaries that translate Sumerian words into Akkadian. If you know anything about Mesopotamian literature, you know it because Ashurbanipal's scribes copied it before the empire fell. But even as Ashurbanipal built his library, the empire was rotting from the inside. The problem started in Babylon. Babylon was always difficult for the Assyrians. The Babylonians spoke a similar language and worshipped similar gods. But they resented Assyrian rule. They rebelled again and again. Ashurbanipal eventually conquered Babylon and installed a puppet king. But after his death around 631 BC, the empire fell into civil war. Two of his sons fought for the throne. The army split. The governors on the periphery stopped sending taxes. And then the enemies struck. The Babylonians rose again under a leader named Nabopolassar. He declared independence. He marched north. But Nabopolassar was not the biggest threat. The biggest threat came from the east, the Medes. The Medes were an Iranian people who lived in the mountains of modern Iran. For decades they had paid tribute to Assyria. But they had been watching. They had learned Assyrian military tactics. They had built their own army. And under their king, Xiaxares, they smelled blood. In 614 BC, the Medes attacked the Assyrian city of Ashur, the religious heart of the empire. They sacked the city and massacred the population. The Babylonian army arrived 3 days too late. The two allies met outside the burning city. Nabopolassar and Xiaxares made a formal alliance. They sealed it by marrying each other's children. The noose was tightening around the Assyrian throat. Part 8. The Fall. The Assyrian king at this point was Sennacherib. He was probably a son of Ashurbanipal. He watched as city after city fell to the coalition. He pulled his remaining armies back to his capital, Nineveh. In the spring of 612 BC, the Medes and Babylonians surrounded Nineveh. The city was enormous. Its walls ran for 12 kilometers around the city center. They were so thick that 3 chariots could drive side by side on top of them. The walls had 15 massive gates, each named for an Assyrian god. The siege lasted 3 months. The attackers built siege towers and ramps. They used battering rams against the gates. The defenders poured burning oil on their heads. But the coalition had numbers and determination. In August of 612 BC, the walls finally broke. What followed was not a battle. It was an extermination. We have a Babylonian clay tablet known as the Fall of Nineveh Chronicle. It describes the scene with cold precision. The allies plundered the city. They burned every building. They tore down the walls. The population was killed or driven out. The last Assyrian king, Sennacherib, died in the flames of his own palace. The fire that destroyed Nineveh had one unintended side effect. It baked the clay tablets in Ashurbanipal's library. The tablets turned to stone. They survived. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 19th century, they found tens of thousands of tablets perfectly preserved in a layer of ash and rubble. The fall of Nineveh in 612 BC did not immediately kill the empire. One Assyrian general, Ashurbanipal II, escaped to the city of Haran in the west. He declared himself king. He sent a desperate message to Egypt asking for help. The Egyptians sent an army. In 609 BC, the Egyptian army marched north to save the last Assyrian remnants. The Babylonians and Medes marched west to stop them. The two armies met at the city of Carchemish. The Babylonians destroyed the Egyptian army. The Egyptians retreated back to the Nile. Haran fell. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was gone. In less than 30 years, the greatest empire the world had ever seen had been deleted from the map. Part 10. What made it great and why it died? So let us answer the two big questions. What made the Neo-Assyrian Empire great, and why did it decline? What made it great was its systems. The Assyrians invented the infrastructure of empire. They created the first professional standing army. They built the first imperial road network. They developed the first bureaucracy that could govern millions of people across thousands of kilometers. They understood that terror could be a tool of statecraft. They understood that deporting populations broke local loyalties. They wrote everything down. Every empire after them, the Persians, the Romans, the British, copied something from the Assyrian playbook. But those same systems contained the seeds of destruction. The empire was built on extraction, not integration. The periphery supplied food, labor, and silver to the center. The periphery received nothing but fear in return. There was no horizontal equality, no shared identity. No sense that an Egyptian or a Babylonian could become Assyrian. They were always subjects, never citizens. That meant the empire had no resilience. When the center grew weak, the periphery had no loyalty to defend. They had waited generations for their revenge. When the Medes and Babylonians attacked, no one came to save the Assyrians. Why would they? The Assyrians had never saved anyone. The decline happened because the empire grew too fast and made too many enemies. Egypt was too far to hold. Babylon was too proud to stay conquered. The Medes were too close to ignore. When those three forces aligned, the Assyrian army, still the best in the world, could not fight on three fronts at once. In 609 BC, the first superpower vanished. The cities were abandoned. The language shifted to Aramaic and then to Arabic. The religion faded. Within a few hundred years, the Greeks were writing about Assyria as a legendary empire, as unreal as Atlantis. But thanks to the fire that baked those clay tablets, we know the truth. The Neo-Assyrian Empire was real, it was brutal, it was brilliant. And it showed us that no empire, no matter how powerful, can survive if its subjects have nothing to lose. If you want to understand the world today, study the Assyrians. Their problems are our problems: overreach, insurgency, the cost of fear, the weight of empire. Thanks for watching.